Chapter 25. Questions and Concerns. By breakfast Monday morning, Violet felt as though her whole life had been turned around in all the best ways possible. Her friendships were all repaired, and nobody was mad at or behaving weirdly toward each other anymore. She had lots of candy, and she had won 3 of the 4 games of exploding snap that she, Cass, and Tracy had played together in the common room that night. Best of all, Tracy had gone around confiscating, by ripping out of people's hands, every copy of which Weeklythat she could find, and throwing into the fireplace to try and stop of the spread of Rita Skeeter's horrible article. Tracy had been extremely thorough. She'd started in Hogsmeade by buying out the post office's whole stock of magazines, and kept it up all through dinner, snatching them out of people's hands, and even nicking 1 or 2 from inside an unsecured backpack. Violet knew that it was impossible to get rid of Frickaby, but seeing so many of them destroyed gave her the smallest hope that nobody else would see it, and maybe all the hubbub would go away in a day or so. These hopes were dashed over her meal of bacon, eggs, and hash as the owl post began to arrive in the great hall. As brown and black and tawny birds began to land, a substantial number of them, with a horribly familiar-looking pink magazine rolled up in their talons, Violet hunched lower and lower in her seat, until she was nearly folded double over her plate. "I'll get them," Tracy said very seriously, once she saw what the problem was. Violet watched her stomp over to the Ravenclaw table with a mixture of joy and further mortification swelling in her chest. "Blimey, she's efficient," Cass muttered. There was a smile on his face, and Violet turned in time to see Tracy rip out the offending page before handing the mangled magazine back to a sour-faced 6th-year girl. "She doesn't have to do that," Violet mumbled, sinking even lower in her seat. "It won't help. Loads of people have already seen it, I bet." "Maybe so, but at least Tracy's having fun." Seeing him staring after Tracy with such a soft, rather proud expression unlocked something in Violet's brain that was how he used to look at her, she realized with a jolt. At the time she'd thought was just a teasing fondness, but seeing it aimed at somebody else let her finally see it for what it really was. "There's one thing I don't get," she said, trying to shake off the sudden wave of awkwardness she felt. Cass looked at her questioningly, his mouth currently too full of scrambled egg to answer. "In that article, when Rita Skeeter gave your name, she mentioned your father's too, like people would recognize it. Is your dad famous or something?" Cass's face went pale. He swallowed his mouthful in one large, painful-sounding gulp. "Look," he rasped, then paused and reached for his glass of milk. Violet waited patiently as he gulped that down as well, appearing to take his time, before setting the empty glass back on the table. "Okay, look," he started again. But whatever he was going to say was interrupted by a loud shout of alarm from somewhere across the great hall. Violet turned around expecting to see Tracy, either getting into a fight or getting told off by a teacher. Instead, she saw Hermione pushing her way through a small crowd of Gryffindors scattering away from their table, some laughing and others covering their ears with their hands. In the midst of them, still seated, were Fred and George. Something in front of them seemed to be smoking. Violet leapt to her feet and started to cross the room, now very curious to see what all the fuss was about, only to stop dead in her tracks, as there was what sounded like a small explosion, and a very familiar, very angry voice began to fill the hall. "Frederick Gideon Weasley." The amplified voice of Mrs. Weasley was loud enough to rattle the windows, and every student in the great hall turned in their seat to witness the unfortunate victim of the howler. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. I thought that I had raised all my sons to be gentlemen, but what I have learned of your recent behavior simply beggars all belief. As if stepping out on your own girlfriend, a girl who you have spoken of very fondly, and whom I was led to believe that you respected and cared for, was not disappointing enough. To learn that you have been dallying with dear, sweet Violet has left me in such a state of disgust that I cannot bear to even look at your portrait. That girl is only 14 years old and has been put through enough. You are my son, but she and Harry are like children to me as well. If you have any decency, I would suggest you apologize to your lovely Angelina and swear to me that you will leave Violet alone. I am very, very disappointed in you. Mum, there was a moment of ringing silence as Mrs. Weasley's howler howled its last, damning words, followed by a low buzz as hundreds of people began to murmur and mutter to each other all at once. Then, a shriek of laughter. Violet stood frozen in the aisle, watching as dozens of heads began to twist and turn in her direction, seeking her out like horrible sunflowers. Fred and George were both sat stock still and staring at the scorch mark the howler had left on the table, while Angelina Johnson, who had not been quick enough to escape from the table, sat hunched forward with her head in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking, but Violet couldn't tell if it was with tears or laughter. Tracy, standing a row over with her arms full of magazines, stared at her in horror. That terrible whine, ominous and familiar, was starting to build at the base of Violet's skull. Panic shot through her as she beheld the sea of faces, so many of them laughing while others stared at her in confusion, only for someone to lean over and start whispering to them. Her hands were starting to go numb, starting at the very tips of her fingers. Everyone was looking at her. "Come," said a voice from behind her, and Violet jolted as a gentle hand was placed upon her back. "Let's get you some air, shall we?" She looked up into the kind, tired of face of Professor Lupin, and the whining stopped. Tears filled her eyes as Violet nodded, and quickly found herself being steered out of the great hall by her godfather's guiding hand. When they arrived at Lupin's third-floor office, he ushered her inside without a word and immediately put on a pot of tea. Violet sat heavily in the chair in front of his desk. Though the fearful whine had gone away, there was still the feeling of an empty pit taking up the place where her midsection was meant to be like all her organs had been sucked away and vanished to make room for the sheer amount of humiliation she now felt. "You were missed at lunch the other day," Professor Lupin said casually as he poured boiling water into two mismatched mugs. "In Hogsmeade, I was looking forward to the chance for all of us to catch up. I fear I haven't been keeping up with my godfatherly duties as of late. Sorry." Violet muttered, gingerly taking the steaming mug by the handle. "It's quite all right, Violet," said Lupin. His tone was very gentle. "Harry informed us of your detention with Professor Snape. If I'd known about it beforehand, I might have been able to have a word with Severus about the timing." Although he smiled slightly, knowing him, I suspect that might have just made things worse. He wasn't too harsh with you, I hope. Lupin was trying to distract her from the humiliation she'd just experienced in the Great Hall, but the subject he'd picked was nearly just as bad. "You're a small, weak little girl." Snape's voice snarled in her brain. "Your tears and your tantrums mean nothing." "No worse than usual," Violet said carefully. "I had to harvest a bucket of frog bits, and he lectured me about, controlling my emotions." "Again, an important lesson, to be sure," said Professor Lupin in a measured voice, "although I'm not sure if he's the best authority on the matter." But thinking of Professor Snape reminded Violet of something else he'd said. Put it away with it, being her anger, that Violet had spent the rest of detention imagining a suitable container for. A big jar was the best she could come up with in the moment, as silly as it seemed. Feeling the pit that still sat in the place of her stomach, Violet wondered if other emotions besides anger could be put into jars as well. Did Harry tell Yowie had detention?" Professor Lupin sat on the corner of his desk and blew on his hot tea. "He mentioned something about a disagreement with Professor Snape, but no, he did not go into detail." Lupin regarded her over the edge of his mug. "Was there something more to it?" Violet hung her head. "I lost my temper again," she admitted after a moment. "Ah." Another magical outburst. The way he said it made Violet think he may have had more than one reason for ushering her out of the great hall so very quickly, not just to spare her feelings, but to try and spare everyone else the consequences of them. She nodded jerkily. "I started a fire." Just a little one, but it was still a fire, she thought ruefully. It didn't matter if it was big or little, it was still a problem. "Oh dear," sighed Professor Lupin. Yes, I can see why that might warrant a detention. You must have been very upset, Violet, to have had such a powerful reaction. May I ask what happened? Face burning as she spoke, Violet said, Pansy Parkinson showed me an article that horrible Skeeter woman wrote about me and Harry. Professor Snape got his hands on it and started reading it out ood, and I wanted it tossed up. I didn't want him to think that I was. Tears were pricking at her eyes again. I just wanted him to stop reading the magazine. I didn't mean to burn it, but I did while he was holding on to it. And that's why I got detention. This magazine, it wouldn't happen to have Beanwich Weekly, would it? Professor Lupin said delicately. Violet looked up at him in despair. So you've already seen it? I'm afraid so, yes. You said Professor Snape was reading it aloud in class. Lupin frowned. Well, if he was trying to get a rise out of you and Harry, it rather sounds like he succeeded. It's not true, Violet cried, seized by a sudden, panicked thought that Lupin might not know that. Not only had it been so long since they were able to sit and chat outside of class, but he'd looked so concerned about her and George attending the Yule Ball together, and he must have seen them spending time together since, or else heard about it from other teachers. But Violet hadn't told him half of her true feelings for George, or all the messy goings-on between her and Cass and Tracy, and then the howler from Mrs. Weasley, if Lupin believed any of it. Nothing she wrote is true, about me or Harry. Him and Hermione are only friends, and so are me and Cass, even though headed like me. But I didn't like him that way, and Fred's with Angelina. I'm George's boyfriend, I mean. Hot tears were spilling freely down her cheeks down, tears of embarrassment and anger and shame, all because of that stupid article. She hoped Tracy managed to grab every single one and burn them in a great pile on the Hogwarts lawns, before any more of her professors could read them and get the wrong idea about her. McGonagall's face swam into her mind, lined with disapproval at catching Violet and George coming up from the kitchens together. I'm not like that, Violet sobbed. What Rita Skeeter said in that article, she made it sound like I'm a proper little tartsaid Aunt Marge's voice. Slutsaid Pansy Parkinson's. I'm not a slut. Violet's hands were trembling again, shaking so hard she was in real danger of spilling tea all over her lap. Violet, said Lupin, sounding aghast, though she didn't have the courage to look up and meet his gaze. I would never think such a thing of you. Rita Skeeter has been peddling poison for over a decade, taking people's words and twisting the truth to suit her own. But it's not the truth, Violet insisted desperately. I've never done anything like that before, I promise. I've only kissed and held hands with George and Tracy, but even that's just. Violet felt the blood drain from her face. The words had come out unbidden. She'd only ever said them once before, apologizing for her actions, but never to another soul had she admitted to what she'd done to having kissed another girl. The pit in her stomach was gone now, but it was replaced with something far worse. As opposed to a hollow emptiness, Violet now felt as though a solid object the size of a cannonball had taken up residence in her chest. But instead of smooth, rounded sides, it was jagged all around and cutting into her insides. Her throat stung, and her heart was beating so wildly against her ribs she thought they might crack. It was only once, she whispered. Her voice came out strangled and tight, almost frantic. Just once. I haven't done it again. I'll never do it again. I promise. Professor Lupin slid from his seat on his desk and knelt down before her. His face appeared level with hers, so that the only way to avoid looking at him was to close her eyes or turn away, but she was too frightened to do either. Only Lupin didn't look angry with her. He didn't look like he was about to tell her off, or say there was something wrong with her, or call her any sorts of horrible names. The expression on his prematurely lined face was somehow soft, and his eyebrows were slightly raised. Violet, please listen to me carefully, he said quietly, because I'm going to tell you something very important. As your teacher, and as your godfather, what you do or don't do with your body, and whomever you do it with, are absolutely none of my business. It's nobody's business but your own. and I give you my word that I will never, ever judge you for any of it. What does matter to me, Theon that matters to me is whether you are happy and healthy and safe. That's all that counts. His hazel eyes were locked onto hers and were filled unlike Professor Snape's gaze, which only ever held coldness, anger, or some other secret thing that Violet had yet to identify with warmth. It was the kind of warmth that she had ever seen in one place before, and that was in the crinkled brown eyes of Mrs. Weasley. A great gasp escaped her. Violet hadn't even realized she'd been holding her breath, but out with the exhale came all the fear and confusion and relief she felt, mingling with a fresh wave of tears streaking down her face. "It's okay," Violet stammered, trying to catch her breath. "To like Talikatha girls. There's not something doubly wrong with me." Lupin's eyes had suddenly gone very shiny. He said thickly, "No, Violet, there is absolutely nothing wrong with you." Violet pitched forward in her seat and threw her arms around Professor Lupin's neck. She felt him tense, but only for a moment before hugging her in return, squeezing her fiercely to his chest. "I've never told anyone," she sobbed into his shoulder. "Not even H. Harry. And I won't tell a soul, I promise," Lupin said. He patted her on the back, and Violet leaned away, trying to wipe away the tears with the back of her hand. Lupin produced a handkerchief for her as he stood up. "Keep it," he told her when she tried handing it back. "You'll likely have more use for it than I would." I know, I always cry," Violet grimaced. "There's nothing wrong with crying either, you know," said Professor Lupin, taking a sip of his now quite cold tea. "I cry fairly often myself, if that's any consolation." It was a great consolation. The only grown man that Violet had ever seen crying was Hagrid, and she'd never heard many other adults ever admit to doing so. Even Aunt Petunia, in her most hysterical moments, rarely shed any actual tears. Lupin checked his pocket watch and sighed. "I'm afraid we've missed the bell." "No, no, it's all right," he said as Violet leapt to her feet. "There's no rush. You can stay in here and take all the time you need, Violet. Let's see, you've got charms this period, correct? I'll write you a note for Professor Flitwick. Though I doubt you'd need one, he's quite fond of you." "Is he?" Violet said, surprised. She had high marks in charms and really enjoyed little Professor Flitwick's lessons, but the idea of people being fond of her was almost as alien as walking on the moon. "Indeed," said Professor Lupin, smiling as he scrounged for a quill and scrap parchment in a drawer in his desk. "I know it may not always feel like it, but you and Harry are surrounded by a great number of people who care for you here. And you can turn to any one of us, should either of you need anything." "Even if I'm not always available," his smile became slightly strained, "I will never turn you away if you're in need of help." Violet mulled on that as Lupin scribbled out an excuse for her and sealed it neatly with a tap of his wand. She took it, staring down at the official-looking RJL. Stamped into the seam. "Can I call you Remus?" she asked suddenly. Professor Lupin raised his eyebrows at her. "Not in class," Violet added hastily. "I just mean, well, Sirius is Harry's godfather, and we all just call him Sirius. But I didn't know if it would be all right to call you. It's just that saying, Professor Lupin, all the time is awfully formal, even though you are me professor, and I don't want to be disrespectful. But when it's just us and Harry and stuff, would it be all right if I just called you Remus sometimes?" Lupin opened his mouth for a moment, closed it, and cleared his throat. His eyes had gone slightly shiny again, Violet noticed. He cleared his throat again. "That would be wonderful, Violet, yes. I have to admit, I still haven't gotten used to being addressed as Sir and Professor by everyone all the time. I keep wanting to look over my shoulder to see who they're really talking to. Remus is much more comfortable," Violet giggled. "Remus is it then? But only sometimes." "But only sometimes," Professor Lupin Remus agreed. The two of them headed out of the office together, sharing a wave as they parted at a fork in the halls, and Violet headed off to class feeling 1,000 pounds lighter. The talk with her godfather gave the courage to walk into Professor Flitwick's class, with her head held high and ignore the titters and whispers. and pointed glances from Pansy and Susanna. As Flitwick explained the safest method to execute the exploding charm, Tracy quietly suggested that they ought to try using it to get rid of all the magazines she'd confiscated since breakfast. But Violet was feeling strangely unbothered by Rita Skeeter's silly old article now. If Remus didn't believe it, and Harry didn't believe it, and Tracy and Cass and George and all the other people who really cared about her knew that none of it was true, then it didn't matter very much what people like Pansy thought of her. It was still embarrassing, but it no longer felt like the whole world was falling down around her. By the end of class, the little pieces of lingering anger and humiliation that remained Violet was able to gather up and stuff into her newly formed emotion jars, put away where they couldn't hurt her anymore. Harry was waiting for her by the castle doors. Ron stood by his side, but there was no sign of Hermione. "Are you all right?" was the first thing Harry asked. "Yeah, I'm fine," said Violet honestly, smiling to show him she meant it. "Remus made me some tea and let me sit in his office for a bit." "I'm okay, Harry, really. Fred wrote back to Mum right away," Ron said, sounding very awkward and apologetic. "Well, I think George mostly told him what to say, but Fred's the one who wrote it down." Him and Angelina were having a right laugh about it before Harry told them off. Violet's eyes widened. "You didn't have to do that. All I said was it wasn't funny," Harry frowned. "You were upset." George didn't look too happy either, actually. "Yeah, 'cause he knows Itchamum will yell at next," said Ron. "Come on, we'll be late for care of magical creatures." Hagrid, who had told them last lesson that they had finished with unicorns, was waiting for them outside his cabin with a fresh supply of open crates at his feet. Violet eyed the crates warily, surely not another Scroot hatching. But when they got near enough to see inside, she found herself looking at a number of fluffy black creatures with long snouts. Their front paws were curiously flat, like spades, and they were blinking up at the class, looking politely puzzled at all the attention. "These ray nifflers," said Hagrid when the class had gathered around. "Ye find 'em down mines mostly. They like sparkly stuff. There ye go, look." One of the nifflers had suddenly leapt up and attempted to bite Pansy Parkinson's watch off her wrist. She shrieked and jumped backwards. Violet decided that nifflers were the most wonderful little creatures in the world, second only to Crookshanks. "Useful little treasure detectors," said Hagrid happily. "Thought we'd have some fun with them today. See over there." He pointed at a large patch of freshly turned earth on the other side of his hut. "I've buried some gold coins. I've got a prize for whoever picks the niffler that digs up the most. Juice, take off all your valuables and choose a niffler and get ready to set 'em loose." Violet pulled the leather cord out from her robes and over her head just to be safe when she heard Hagrid exclaim, "Blimey, Violet!" She looked up to find Hagrid staring at the necklace in her hand. Not at the gleaming silver ring, but at the simple, polished bone totem that hung from it. It was the very same one that he had gifted her for her very first Christmas at Hogwarts. Do ye wear tha often?" he asked. Violet beamed at him. "Almost every day. But I didn't wear it the day they put me in the lake for Harry's task. I didn't want it to get lost." Hagrid's eyes had gone even shinier than Professor Lupin's, and she could see his cheeks had gone ruddy underneath his grizzled beard. "Right, best put it away for safekeeping," Hagrid said, suddenly sounding as though he had a head cold. Violet stuffed her necklace into her bag and pretended not to notice when Hagrid turned around and blew his nose into a spotted handkerchief the size of a tablecloth. When she picked up a niffler, it immediately tucked its long snout under her chin and sniffed enthusiastically. It was really quite cuddly, though its black fur was much coarser than it looked. "Hang on," said Hagrid, looking down into the crate. "There's a spare niffler here. Who's missing?" "Where's Hermione?" "She had to go to the hospital wing," said Ron. "We'll explain later," Harry muttered, glancing darkly in the direction of Pansy Parkinson, who was openly eavesdropping. It was easily the most fun they had ever had in care of magical creatures. The nifflers dove in and out of the patch of earth as though it were water, each scurrying back to the student who had released it, and spitting gold into their hands. Ran's was particularly efficient. It had soon filled his lap with coins. "Can you buy these as pets, Hagrid?" he asked excitedly as his niffler dived back into the soil, splattering his robes. "Your mum wouldn't be happy, Ran," said Hagrid, grinning. "They wreck houses, nifflers." "I reckon they've nearly got the lot now," he added, pacing around the patch of earth while the nifflers continued to dive. "I only buried 100 coins." "Oh, there, yeah, Hermione." Violet, who was having a hard time stopping her niffler from simply curling up to sleep in her lap, looked up to see Hermione walking toward them across the lawn. Her hands were very heavily bandaged, and she looked miserable. "What happened?" Violet asked, staring in concern. "Later," said Harry and Hermione together. Once all the nifflers had finished their last laps through the dirt, Hagrid called out, "Well, let's check how ye have done. Count your coins. And there's no point trying to steal any goyle," he added, his beetle-black eyes narrowed. "It's leprechaun gold, vanishes after a few hours." Goyle emptied his pockets, looking extremely sulky. It turned out that Ran's niffler had been the most successful, so Hagrid gave him an enormous slab of Honeydukes chocolate for a prize. The bell rang across the grounds for lunch. The rest of the class set off back to the castle, but Violet stayed along with Harry and his friends, ostensibly to help put the nifflers back in their boxes. But what Violet was really after was the gossip. "What have ye done to your hands, Hermione?" said Hagrid, just as Violet had opened her mouth to ask the same. "Undiluted barbatuber pus," Hermione said, looking sourly down at her bandages. "Someone sent it to me in the mail after reading that ridiculous article by Rita Skeeter. It's lucky I only opened a few of them, and only one of those was dangerous. We opened some more after you left," Ron said. "One lady threatened to mail you a curse as soon as she could find a big enough envelope, so maybe don't open anything else for a while." "You get letters about the article," said Violet, shocked. "What for?" Hermione's cheeks went rather red. "Apparently because I'm a two-timing hussy that's no good for Harry. They all said the most absurd, horrible things that I should be boiled in frog spawn, and the like." "Ah, darn worry," said Hagrid gently, looking down at her. "I got some o' those same letters and all, after Rita Skeeter wrote a boomy mum. Ye're a monster, and ye should be put down. Your mother killed innocent people, and if you have any decency you jump in a lake." "No," said Hermione, looking shocked. "Yeah," said Hagrid, heaving the niffler crates over by his cabin wall. "There's juice, nutters, Hermione. Darn open 'em if ye get any more. Chuck 'em straight in the fire. That's what Tracy's been doing with every copy off which Weaklish sees," Violet told her. "Maybe if we get enough, we can put it all together in a pile and have a bonfire." "Not if people are trying to send curses through the post," said Hermione, though she did smile a bit at the suggestion. "Gotten anything horrible, have you?" Hermione asked her as they headed back toward the castle. "Nothing yet," Violet said gratefully. "Well, unless you count Mrs. Weasley's howler, but that wasn't sent to me. You didn't hear any of it, did you?" "A bit," Hermione grimaced. "I just left breakfast when it went off, but her voice carried." "Yeah." Violet agreed, thinking of the way the windows had rattled. "Come on, Violet, it could be a lot worse. At least your fingers aren't full of pus." Hermione glared down at her bandaged hand, wincing as she tried to bend her fingers into a fist. "I hateth that Skeeter woman," she burst out savagely. "I'll get her back for this if it's the last thing I do." As the four of them headed back inside the castle, they were held up by a small crowd in the entrance hall, gathered around the base of the grand staircase and chuckling. "What's going on?" asked Hermione, standing on tiptoes to try and peek over everyone's heads. Her question was answered by a loud, outraged cry. "How could you?" called a voice from above, sounding dramatic to the point of parody. "My own brother, I thought we were friends." Violet looked up and saw, with equal parts awe and horror, George Weasley standing on the landing, brandishing a rolled-up magazine in his fist in one hand, while the other clutched his own chest in mock agony. A few steps below him was Fred, kneeling with his hands clasped in front of him and sounding just as stricken. "Brother," It's not what you think, Fred cried desperately. I would never betray your trust, you know that. So says the liar Theddletera, said George, advancing on him with cartoon menace. He pointed the magazine at Fred as though it were a sword. But I have here the written proof that you've been putting the moves on my girlfriend. Have you nothing to say for yourself, you knave? Violet didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and so just ended up standing with her mouth hanging open in shock. Fortunately, no one had spotted her yet. The crowd giggled and tittered at the performance, nudging and whispering to one another. Angelina Johnson stood watching with a look of great amusement on her face. Fred threw himself forward at George's feet, pleading, "It wasn't me. I swear it on our mother's life. I've been framed." It must have been someone else who just looked like me. I look like you, said George, lowering his weapon. Fred popped his head up and said in a normal voice, "Oh yeah, must have been you then." "Must have been," said George, shrugging. He put out a hand and pulled Fred to his feet, and the audience went wild with laughter and applause. While the Weasley twins bowed to their adoring fans, George's eyes landed on Violet behind the crowd. He must have seen something of the panicked emotions warring on her face, because his smile dropped slightly. Violet, who hated attention, but who was also very tired of being made to feel embarrassed and miserable against her will, threw a smile onto her face and bravely stepped forward. George's grin returned in an instant. He pointed his magazine at her and cried, "And here she is now, my fair lady approaches." The crowd parted for her with a chorus afterwards as she joined the Weasley twins. Fred put his hands up and took several strides back, putting a pointed amount of distance between her and himself, much to the crowd's amusement. George made a great show of bowing to kiss the back of Violet's hand. "Just trying to clear up all the confusion," he said brightly, shaking the magazine in his fist. "Some people can be so pig-headed, but I reckon we got the point across." "Probably," Violet agreed, "but just to be sure." And she leaned up and kissed him, right there on the stairs in front of everyone. While fresh copies of which weekly continued to arrive over the course of the week, all the hubbub about Rita Skeeter's article had gotten stale. Most people's focus had been shifted to the frankly alarming amount of homework being set to them before the Easter holidays. The only teacher Tarnat set them up with at least 2 essays and 100 extra pages of reading was Professor Moody. Violet didn't know if he hated grading written work or just liked hurting children. Their defense against the dark arts lessons had become very hand-on, and in their latest class, Moody had given them such a rigorous test of hex deflection that many of them were nursing small injuries. Violet stayed behind after class to wait for Tracy, who was having a hard time keeping her eyes open with the way her eyelashes kept trying to knot themselves together. "Hold a moment, Potter," Moody said, after putting Tracy to rights. "I want a word." "Sir." Violet approached Moody's desk cautiously. The door swung shut behind her with a dull thud. She didn't think she'd done anything to get herself into trouble during class, but with Professor Moody, it was very difficult to tell. She tried to read the expression on his scarred, mangled face as she approached where he was seated behind his desk. "I've been hearing things about you, girl. About the sort of company you keep," Moody said. For the first time in a week, Violet's stomach did a horrible flip. Had he read Thewitch Weekly article, Moody's normal, beady eye fixed on her with a hard stare. "A little birdie told me Snape's been giving you secret lessons." "Oh," Violet sighed in relief. Sort of. They're not really secret, sir. Advertises them, does he?" Moody swiveled his chair to face her. "Offers tutoring on the weekends for all his students." "No, sir," Violet said carefully, "but he's never told me not to tell anyone about it either." It was true the only thing Professor Snape had said on the subject of her lessons was that she shouldn't go around bragging about them, so that nobody came and bothered him about wanting lessons of their own. It had been her choice to keep it a secret from Harry. "What's he teach you in these detentions of yours?" asked Moody. "It's just more potions, sir," said Violet, shrugging. "Things we're not meant to cover in class until next year, and how to handle some of the more complex ingredients. And sometimes it really is a detention, and he'll have me scrubbing cauldrons or harvesting frog brains. Is that so? Moody said, giving her what Violet thought was a small smile, though his lopsided mouth made it very hard to tell. And the expression faded quickly, returning to that same searching stare. What about spells, curses? Snape ever teach you any of those? Not unless it's required for a potion, Violet said slowly. Maybe she wasn't in trouble, but she was starting to think that Professor Snape could be if Professor Moody didn't like what she told him. He taught me the babbling curse because you need it to finish brewing a babbling beverage, but nothing else, sir. You can stop that. All the sirs, Moody waved his hand dismissively. You're awful polite for a Slytherin. Some of your little friends could learn a thing or two from you there. We're not all rude, Violet said, filled with a sudden indignant pride for her house. It's just Malfoy who's a prat, sir. Sorry, I mean, Moody's mouth stretched again, and this time Violet was sure it was a smile. A prat he is, and even worse than that, Professor Moody grumbled, pausing to take a deep swig from his hip flask. He grimaced, as though whatever was in it didn't taste very nice. Even his kind can be polite when it suits them, but polite doesn't mean it. Malfoy hasn't given you any more trouble, has he? No, nope, said Violet hastily. In her mind's eye, she recalled the horrible sight of a pure white ferret bouncing off the flagstone floor, squealing in pain and humiliation. Even if Malfoy had been bothering her, she wouldn't ever wish that on him again. What about the Warrington boy? Moody asked, catching Violet off guard. Cass, what about him? He ever give you any grief? Boy's a few years ahead of you, yet the two of you seem thick as thieves. When you're speaking to each other, that is. A slight chill went up the back of Violet's spine. What did Professor Moody care about her friendship with Cass, and how did he know about the times they'd been fighting? We're just friends, she said, trying not to sound as unsettled as she felt. And how'd that come about? Moody leaned forward in his seat. It's not like you share classes, sit next to each other every day. He stopped me from getting into trouble as a first year, and Professor Flitwick had him tutor me and Tracy in charms. More tutoring. Seems like you've got friends in high places, Potter. People looking out for you, pushing you. That's good. Professor Moody's magical eye, which had been lazily rolling around in its socket, suddenly whizzed around and fixed upon Violet. That's very good, considering the sort you've surrounded yourself with. What sort is that, sir? Violet asked warily. The sort that you shouldn't turn your back on, Moody growled. He leaned even closer toward her, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared with both eyes into Violet's startled face. I couldn't believe it when they told me your house. The little Potter girl, all alone in that nest of vipers. Malfoy, Warrington, Snape. Names I was familiar with long before Dumbledore brought me to this school. Names that you, Andy especially, he pointed a crooked finger at her, need to watch out for. Constant vigilance. Violet flinched badly. Moody dropped his hand and sat back in his chair. His magical blue eye drifted sideways, making him look comically cross-eyed for a moment, and he said, Go on now, Potter. Miss Davis is waiting for you outside the door. Heart hammering in her chest, Violet had to stop herself from breaking into a run on her way out of the classroom. The door swung open before she reached it, only to shut behind her as soon as she'd crossed the threshold. Tracy, who had been leaning against the corridor, took one look at Violet's face and frowned. You all right, Romans 6? What was all that about? I don't know, said Violet. She grabbed Tracy's hand, comforted by the warmth of it, and began to pull her away from Moody's class with hurried steps. But I think I need to talk to Cass. Finding Cass was not difficult. He hung out in all the same places that Tracy and Violet did, usually with them, and was tall enough that picking him out of a crowd was no trouble. But getting him to simply sit down and talk had proven almost impossible. As a sixth year, the amount of homework Cass had been saddled with was enough to make Violet's head spin. Every time she'd seen him lately, it had been hunched over at least two open textbooks with even more stacked nearby, sheafs of parchment being passed around between his fellow classmates while they all frowned and muttered amongst themselves. Even Tracy hadn't had any luck getting his attention. She stood pouting by his shoulder, arms crossed in front of her, until Cass very apologetically waved her away, promising to make time for her when he could. By the time Easter had come and gone, Violet's brain was so fried from the stress of all her own exams that she had quite forgotten about Professor Moody's cryptic warning. It had been replaced by the memorization of half a dozen charms, wand movements, and important historical dates. The start of the summer term had crept up suddenly, and with it Violet couldn't help but feel a low, building sense of dread. It started to hit her around the same time every year since she and Harry had been at Hogwarts, the knowledge that very soon they would be sent back to Privet Drive. Even with Uncle Vernon out of the house, number 4 never had been and never would be a comfortable home for them. Dudley no longer pushed them around, but he was also too scared to be in the same room as Harry and Violet most days, and whatever familial affection Aunt Petunia had for them started and ended with keeping them from starving and putting a roof over their heads. There was no love with the Dursleys. There was no kindness or silliness or comfort to be found in that house, and the thought of going back to it made Violet want to take off running into the forbidden forest, hiding amongst the brambles and shrubbery until summer's end, when she could stride out from the tree line and go straight back to school. She knew that Harry had asked once if they could stay at Hogwarts year-round, but such a thing was not allowed, and so he'd never asked again. But if Nobodiknuthi were there? As the weeks flew by, Violet's thoughts of disappearing into the woods became less idle daydreams and more of a robust plan. If she and Harry used his invisibility cloak, they could stash their trunks in the forest before the end of term and have plenty of time to build a rudimentary shelter. Hagrid lived in his hut year-round, and he surely liked them too much to turn them in if they went to him for food and water from time to time. He might even lend them Fang for protection against the dangers lurking in the trees. And the centaurs that lived in the forest weren't that dangerous, so long as she and Harry were polite and stayed out of their way. Violet was startled out of her plotting by an arm being slung around her shoulders and a kiss being pressed to the side of her head. "Hey, you," said George, his freckled face smiling down at her. "Wanna see something cool?" "Yeah," Violet said without hesitation. George's smile broadened into a grin. "Ah, I knew I liked you for a reason." "Come on, we're sneaking out." "Out where?" Violet wrapped an arm around his middle as they pivoted in the hall. She was slightly disappointed to see Fred would be joining them. She liked Fred very much, but she'd hoped that George might be taking her off on another little adventure with just the two of them, like their trip to the kitchens. "Are we going to Hogsmeade?" "Not that far, but your enthusiasm for rule-breaking is noted," Fred said with a laugh. "Just out to the grounds tonight." "Ludo Bagman's meeting all the champions at the Quidditch pitch tonight," said George quietly, to give them all the details about the third task. "We're gonna eavesdrop." "How do you know that?" Violet asked, surprised. Fred began to whistle casually as they strolled outside through the double doors. It wasn't curfew yet, but they were cutting it close. "Heard Snape telling Warrington about it at the end of class today," George told her. Violet looked at him out of the corner of her eye. "So is this to get a sneak peek at the third task, or is this about whatever's going on with you two and Ludo Bagman?" Fred and George exchanged glances. "About the task, of course," said George. "Of course," said Fred. "Of course," said Violet, rolling her eyes as the three of them set out into the cloudy night. They walked down the dark lawn to the Quidditch stadium, ducked into a little covered alcove, and began to climb the wooden steps up into the stands. At the top, they bent low out of sight and peered down onto the field below. "What have they done to it?" Fred said indignantly, standing up straight. The Quidditch field was no longer smooth and flat. It looked as though somebody had been building long, low walls all over it that twisted and crisscrossed in every direction. "Are those bricks?" said George, standing as well to lean out over the railing and squint at the strange construction. "Actually, look at the dirt underneath." "I think they might be hedges." "A hedge maze," Violet breathed. From this vantage point, they could perfectly see the layout of a great labyrinth spanning the entirety of the field below. It's a giant hedge maze. I bet the champions will have to get through it to the other side. What is that all? Said Fred. That doesn't sound too hard. And it doesn't sound very fun to watch either, said George, sounding peeved. I mean, we already spent an hour standing around watching the lake, while all the action was going on underwater. How long do you reckon they'll have us get down? He and Fred ducked in unison, and Violet's eye followed to where George was silently pointing. A little ways over, through a gap in the stands, Cass and Harry were walking onto the field together. We're too far. I can't hear, George grumbled, and Bagman's not with them. There he is. Fred nodded to the other side of the field, where Ludo Bagman was striding with Fleur de Lacquer, and Victor Crumb in tow. Violet was surprised to see Fleur positively beaming at Harry. Perhaps his attempt to rescue her little sister had earned him some goodwill with her. With all four champions present, Violet, Fred, and George watched as Bagman began to gesture around them as he talked, evidently explaining the details of the third task, though the three of them were too far away to catch more than partial snatches of words and the occasional excited clap from Bagman himself. When the group below grew quiet and began to turn and leave the pitch, the Weasley twins scrambled into action. Bet he'll try to talk to Harry again, Fred said as they hurried back down the steps, trying not to clump too loudly as they went. We can get him alone, have a word then. Get him alone, Violet repeated as she trailed behind them. What, are you planning to mug him or something? Or something, they said at the same time. George stopped suddenly and turned back to her, looking slightly uncomfortable as he said, We just want a word with him, that's all. He's been dodging us since the Quidditch World Cup, but we really need the Fred cleared his throat loudly, and George stopped talking. As the boys looked at each other, Violet realized they were doing the same thing she and Harry often did twin-to-twin communication. A whole conversation, made up of nothing but eye contact and tiny facial expressions that nobody else but them could understand. She would have found it wonderful if only she didn't feel so left out. I'm cold, she said loudly, interrupting their silent argument. I think I'll just go back up to the castle and wait for Harry. They both looked at her, and George's face crumpled into a smile of gratitude. By leaving on her own terms, she had spared him the discomfort of having to send her away. I'm glad you got to see the maze, Roman 6, he said sweetly. And next time Wedder run off to Hogsmeade, I'll be sure to bring you along. They exchanged another quick hug. Violet giggled as George pressed a fat kiss to the middle of her forehead before she hurried back across the dark castle grounds, leaving Fred and George to their mysterious business with Bagman. Violet's excuse of meeting up with Harry, however, was immediately dashed. Coming around the edge of the Quidditch pitch, she watched in dismay as Victor Crumb walked up and pulled Harry aside. The two of them headed away from the castle, looking deep in conversation, probably about what they'd just learned of the task to come. As she stood indecisively in the darkness, a lone figure trudged into sight. Cass, making his way back to the castle. Bloody hell, he cried, when Violet jogged up from behind and poked him in the side. He started to go for his wand until he recognized her face grinning up at him. Roman 6, what are you doing out here? Eavesdropping, she said loftily. I heard about you and Harry being told about the final task. The maze looks fun. Cass stared at her in bewilderment for a moment, then shook his head. Bagman said it'll grow to about 20 foot high, then they're going to fill it with monsters and curses for us to get through. Loads of fun, that. Monsters? What kind of monsters? Well, Bagman said creatures, but if it's Hagrid providing them, then we know what they really are. Hagrid's favorite creatures aren't all monsters, Violet said defensively, thinking of the nifflers and unicorns they'd worked with recently. But Cass shot her a pointed look, and then she remembered the Scroots. Well, okay, but you should be all right with the curses. You're brilliant at spellwork. I'm all right, said Cass, but even in the low light Violet could see that his ears had gone red, and there was a small, smug little grin on his face. They hurried up the stone castle steps, and Violet was immediately grateful for the wall of warmth that greeted them as they stepped inside. "What happens if you run into another champion in the maze?" Violet asked, lowering her voice as they passed a small group of ghosts floating through the entrance hall. "You're not going to have to fight each other, are you?" Bagman didn't say anything about that. Cass frowned. "We'll enter separately, but Harry and I get a head start for having high scores. He only mentioned getting past the obstacles. But what would you do if you ran into Fleur in there, or if Crumb tried to get in your way?" Violet pressed. "Wouldn't you have to get around them somehow? Dueling's not part of the tournament, as far as I know. And besides, it's a great bloody maze, isn't it? I think the whole point is we're not likely to run into each other." "But what if? I'm not gonna have to fight your brother, Violet," Cass snapped suddenly. He'd wheedled out the question she was really asking, but was too afraid to say out loud. "And if I do have to fight him, I'll just lay down my wand and let him walk right past to me the Triwizard Cup. Is that what you want me to say?" "No, but you said you'd go easy on Harry," said Violet, hurt. "You promised at the beginning of the tournament, and it will go easy on him, in the extremely unlikely event we end up facing off against one another in a giant cursed hedge maze. But I'm not going to just let him win, either. Look, Romans 6. He came to a sudden stop as they approached the slithering common room, turning to face her even as he avoided meeting her eyes. "I'm a Hogwarts champion," he said. There was a pleading quality to his voice, which she had never heard before. "I've never been the champion of anything, let alone something like representing a whole school. This isn't just a game to me. Whoever wins this tournament will go down in the history books. It's a chance for me to make a name for myself, instead of just—" He paused, frowning suddenly as though angry with himself, and then said, "I want the Warrington name something to be proud of. I want to be proud of it again, and I want to make my mum proud too. She deserves that, after all she's been through." Violet stared at him. Though she hadn't thought about it in months, Rita Skeeter's article still lingered word for word in the dark recesses of her mind, and a single line now jumped out at her. "Cassius Warringtonson, of disgraced historian Randall Warrington." "You never did tell me about your dad, Cass," said Violet quietly. Cass was silent for a long moment. "No, I didn't." He still wouldn't look at her. "Do you want to talk about it?" Cass let out a bitter-sounding little laugh. "Do Iwanto? Absolutely not. I've actually been dreading that conversation for the last 4 years, to be honest. No, Violet, I do not want to talk to you about my dad." He glared down at his shoes, scuffing them against the cold stone of the dungeon floor. In the flickering torchlight that lit the halls, Violet could see the deep frown on Cass's face, and the way his eyebrows pulled tight together in the middle, a deep, straight crease forming perfectly between them. "But I will tell you," he muttered suddenly, "because you deserve to know. But not right now, and not right here in the middle of the bloody hallway where anybody can wander up on us. We're lucky Filch hasn't coming shambling out of the shadows yet, as it is." "But Yao will tell me," Violet said. She was still staring at him, and he finally raised his eyes to look at her. "I will tell you," he repeated, nodding. Cass held up his hand in a fist, with just his little finger extended. "Just later. Pinky promise, yeah." Violet, who had taught him how to pinky promise, smiled despite herself as she linked her finger with his. They shook on it once, like closing a business deal, and then the two of them walked together into the slithering common room in search of Tracy, to tell her about the evening's goings-on. Chapter 26. The Pensive. After a night of sound, dreamless sleep, Violet woke up bright-eyed and cheerful, with a loudly purring Crookshanks kneading his paws into her stomach. Her good mood lasted only so far as the top step coming out of the dungeons, where she was immediately ambushed by her brother. Harry, his wild eyes made wilder by the dark circles beneath them, grabbed her by the hand and muttered, "Something happened last night." Icy fear built itself up in Violet's veins as Harry told her everything that had happened to him the night before. Going off with Crumb to talk about Hermione, only to find an extremely disheveled Barty Crouch wandering out of the trees. Crouch's strange rambling about his son, and Bertha Jorkins, and something he'd done that he needed to tell Professor Dumbledore about. Fetching Dumbledore, and coming back to find Crumb stunned on the ground, and no sign of Mr. Crouch, Karkaroff's accusations of treachery, and Hagrid's frightening rage. It was all too much, too early in the morning. Violet squeezed her brother's hand, still firmly clasped in her own, and said, "We need to go and tell Remus." "It's still early," Harry said, looking reluctant. "I don't want to wake him and be a bother." "It won't be a bother, he'll want to know," Violet insisted. "He told me we can come to him any time, Harry, about anything." "Come on." Still holding on to each other's hands, the Potters hurried toward Professor Lupin's office, only to stop dead right outside the door. He doesn't actually sleep in here, does he?" Violet asked, looking at Harry with trepidation. "I mean, the teachers have got to have their own rooms, but I don't know where." "We could find him if we still had the map," Harry frowned. "Hasn't Moody given it back to you yet?" Violet shook her head. The Marauder's map was extremely handy for circumstances exactly like these, but she'd simply been too scared to ask Professor Moody to return it. "We could just wait for him at breakfast," she suggested. "Or the staff room," said Harry. "Maybe he's in there before classes start." As they spoke, the door to the office swung open. They turned to look at Professor Lupin, who halted mid-step and stared at them in surprise. "Good morning, you two," he said, smiling. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this?" He pulled out his pocket watch and glanced at it. 6:30 in the morning visit. "Something happened last night," Harry said again. After being ushered into the office, he began recounting the entire tale again, his voice shaking with emotion and adrenaline. "Just a moment," said Lupin, as soon as Harry said that Mr. Couch had talked about Voldemort. Violet and Harry watched as he stood and walked quickly to the door of his office, yanked it open, and stuck his head out into the corridor. Evidently not finding any eavesdroppers, Lupin shut the door and locked it. He dug through one of the pockets of his robes as he returned to his seat and placed a handful of little wrapped chocolates on top of his desk. "Here, have one of these," Lupin said, looking very serious as he pushed the sweets toward them. "Harry, if you could go through that again for me, please. What exactly did Barty Crouch say?" "I told you, he wasn't making much sense," said Harry. "He said he wanted to warn Dumbledore about something. He definitely mentioned Bertha Jorkins, and he seemed to think she was dead. He kept saying stuff was his fault. He mentioned his son, though she hadn't been present for the Hogsmeade visit, where Sirius had given an explanation of Crouch's family and professional background. Harry had filled her on the important details. Barty Crouch, on the verge of becoming Minister of Magic, had sentenced his own son to Azkaban as a Death Eater, and had suffered a mighty fall from grace because of it. "He was out of his mind," Harry went on. "Half the time he seemed to think his wife and son were still alive, and he kept talking to Percy Ran's brother, his assistant, about work and giving him instructions." "And what did he say about Voldemort?" Lupin prompted. "He said that he was getting stronger," Harry said dully. "But he was out of his mind, like you said," said Violet, clinging to a little scrap of hope. "He could have just been raving." "He was sanest when he was trying to talk about Voldemort," said Harry. The hope crumbled in Violet's grasp. "He was having real trouble stringing two words together, but that was when he seemed to know where he was and know what he wanted to do. He just kept saying he had to see Dumbledore." "But Crouch never got the chance to speak with Dumbledore, did he?" said Lupin sharply. "You and Victor Crumb were the only ones to actually speak with Crouch. If Snape hadn't held me up," Harry said bitterly, "we might have actually got there in time. The headmaster is busy, Potter." "What's this rubbish, Potter? Why couldn't he have just got out of the way?" "Did you tell him it was important?" Violet asked, and Harry scowled at her. "Of course I did, Romans 6. I told him Crouch was outside and that he wanted Dumbledore, but it was like he didn't want me to get Dumbledore's attention." The great ugly git just stood there. "And that's enough, Harry," said Professor Lupin firmly, and Harry shut his mouth. The lines on Remus's young face stood out even more strongly than usual as he sat deep in thought, frowning down at the scuffed surface of his desk. I'll need to go and have a word with Dumbledore, find out whether or not Mad Eye was able to track Crouch down. If he had the Marauder's map on him, it would have been easy, said Harry. The map, said Lupin, looking up in surprise. Why would Moody have the map? Violet gulped. Because I gave it to him, she said in a small voice. She had not yet admitted this to Remus won the Creators off the map, along with her own father, and his expression of bewilderment only made her feel justified in keeping it from him. Well, he asked to borrow it, and I didn't think I could say no. I dropped it while we were out after hours, Harry said at once, positioning himself to take the blame for her mistake, as usual. Moody caught us and picked it up. He wanted to keep it when he saw what it was. I'm sure he did, said Lupin. He sat back heavily in his chair, but fortunately he didn't look angry with them. For a man as nosy and paranoid as Mad Eye Moody, I'm sure being able to keep tabs on everyone's location would be Christmas come early. I'll make sure that he returns it to you, Violet, but for now I can't argue that it might be better off in his hands. Thank you, Harry, very much for telling me about all of this. However, he stood abruptly and put his hands on the desk, looking very serious once more. I need you both to swear to me that you will not go walking with anyone else at night, for any reason. Walking off into the forest, with Victor Crumb of all people, was an extremely rash thing for you to do, Harry. There is somebody highly dangerous at Hogwarts, somebody who very clearly wanted to stop Barty Crouch from seeing Dumbledore, and you were probably feet away from them in the dark. He swallowed hard, and said in a much lower, harsher voice, You could have been killed. So what if there were Somione in the trees? Said Harry indignantly. They would have had plenty of time to have a go at me. But they waited till I was out of the way until they acted, didn't they? So how could I be their target? No one's tried to attack me all year. No one's done anything to me at all, except to put your name in the goblet of fire, said Lupin, his eyes flashing. That was no accident, Harry, believe you me, and if somebody means to harm you without attacking directly, then they're on their last chance. I am begging you, stay close to your friends, do not leave your common rooms after hours. And I want you both to come back here to my office tomorrow after lunch. What, so we can report back to you about how we're not getting into trouble, said Harry, his arms crossed sourly over his chest. Lupin's expression softened slightly. So that I can give you some brief lessons in self-defense, Lupin said. I know Professor Moody has been teaching you how to block and counter harmful spells, but I think knowing a few good hexes of your own could come in handy down the line. You're going to teach us how to fight? Violet asked, her eyes widening. She and Harry looked to each other, twin grins on their twin faces. Not exactly, Violet, Lupin said quickly, but I would very much like to teach you how Target Altafa fight, should you ever find yourselves in one. How does that sound? Brilliant, said Violet and Harry together. Professor Lupin clapped his hands together, smiling again for the first time since they'd stepped into his office. Excellent. I'll see if I can't dig out some of my defense against the dark arts lesson plans. Here, take these. He scooped the chocolates off his desk and pushed them into the twins' hands, and I'll see you both tomorrow. With the summer sun now beginning to beat down overhead, there was no place Violet would rather be than indoors, tucked in with a good book and a cold glass of pumpkin juice. For the next few days, she spent all of her free time either in the library, looking up fun hexes, or else in Professor Lupin's classroom, practicing said hexes on Harry. But of course it was never just Harry. He'd been bringing Ron and Hermione along to their lessons with Remus, much to Violet's chagrin, but today, at least, she was willing to let go of her annoyance. Harry was working on the stunning spell, which he had never used before. The trouble was that practicing it required a target, and Violet, who had been hit by two stunning spells simultaneously at the Quidditch World Cup, seemed to be particularly susceptible to its effects. Can't we find another boggart or something to practice on? Ron suggested on Monday lunchtime, as he lay flat on his back in the middle of the Charms classroom. Lupin had arranged with Professor Flitwick for them to work in there, having just been stunned and rewoken by Harry for the 5th time in a row. Stunning spells don't work on Bargots, unfortunately, said Professor Lupin. He was reclined with his feet on Flitwick's desk and watching them with great amusement. A fact I'd hoped you would remember from my class, Ron. Right, yeah, I remember, said Ron, going slightly pink. Maybe we could use Darby then. I bet he'd do anything to help you, Harry. I'm not complaining or anything. He got gingerly to his feet, rubbing his backside, but I'm aching all over. Well, you keep missing the cushions, don't you? Said Hermione impatiently, rearranging the pile of cushions they had used for the banishing spell, which Flitwick had left in a cabinet. Just try and fall backward. Once you're stunned, you can't really pick which direction you fall in, Hermione, said Violet. She was still nursing a headache from her first and only turn as a test target, where she'd banged the back of her head on the floor so loudly that Remus forbade her from going again. She looked at Hermione and said sweetly, "Why don't you take a turn?" "Well, I think Harry's got it now anyways," said Hermione hastily, "and we don't have to worry about disarming because he's been able to do that for ages." "Has he?" said Lupin, raising his eyebrows. "That's quite advanced for a fourth year, Harry. Where did you learn it from?" Lockhart tried to start a dueling club in second year, but I don't think he really knew what he was doing. Harry was clearly fighting back a grin as he said, "Snape disarmed him so hard he flew into a wall." "Ah, yes, that does sound like something Severus would do." Lupin smiled slightly. "I only vaguely remember Lockhart from when we were in school. His second year was my last, I believe, but from the stories I've heard told in the staff room of his time as a professor, I'm inclined to believe it was warranted." The bell rang. They hastily went about righting Flitwick's classroom before splitting up in the hallway. Lupin had a class to teach, and Harry and Ron were both heading to divination. "See you at dinner," Hermione called back to them, as she and Violet both set off for their arithmancy classroom on the 7th floor. Broad strips of dazzling gold sunlight fell across the corridor from the high windows. The sky outside was so brightly blue it looked as though it had been enameled. "It's going to be so hot in Professor Vector's room," Violet grumbled as they ascended staircase after staircase. "Right under the roof, with the sun shining all the day." "Oh, you're probably right," said Hermione unhappily. And she was. The brightly lit room was swelteringly hot. As she took her assigned seat in the middle row of desks, Violet imagined she could hear the rafters overhead crackling in the heat. Her head was still aching terribly, and she found herself squinting at the stark white lines of chalk up on the blackboard at the front of the room. Professor Vector swept to the front of the class and began the roll call in her low, lilting voice. "Today, my students, we will begin by going over the theorems I assigned to you last week. I trust that you have all completed the reading assignment as well." Her pale eyes surveyed the class, and many people dropped their gazes guiltily. Professor Vector made a little hum of disappointment. "In that case, perhaps we shall instead begin by reading together in the class. To those who have completed the assigned reading, you may read ahead. Take out your books, please, and silently begin." The room was filled with the shuffling of book bags and the turning of pages. When Dean Thomas dropped his bag onto the floor, the sound of it was so unnaturally thunderous that Violet flinched in her seat. She looked at it, expecting to see a brick or perhaps a bowling ball spilling out of it, something to account for the tremendous thud it had made. But there were only books and parchment visible from where she sat. Violet shook her head a mistake. Her brain felt like a particularly loose pudding sloshing around in her skull and looked down at her book. She had been one of the few who actually did the reading when they were supposed to, which meant she got to move on to the next chapter. Only she having a hard time getting the words to come into focus. The text must have gotten smaller since the last time Violet looked at it, or else her eyes had suddenly gotten worse, because she had to keep blinking to stop everything from going fuzzy. She squeezed her eyes shut, and when she opened them the words looked much clearer, but they didn't stay that way for very long. She closed her eyes again, breathing in the classroom's hot air through her nose and trying not to move her head too much. Deep breaths. She would just rest her eyes until everything came back into focus, that's all. She was riding on the back of an eagle owl, soaring through the clear blue sky toward an old, ivy-covered house set high on a hillside. Lower and lower they flew, the sun beating relentlessly on Violet's back, until they reached a dark and broken window in the upper story of the house and entered. Now they were flying along a gloomy passageway to a room at the very end. Through the door they went, into a dark room whose windows were boarded up. Violet, but she wasn't Violet. She was Harry in this dream, which wasn't unusual to her at all. They often took turns being one another in dreams had left the owl's back. She was watching now as it fluttered across the room into a chair with its back to her. There were two dark shapes on the floor beside the chair. Both of them were stirring. One was a huge snake. The other was a man. A short, balding man, a man with watery eyes and a pointed nose. He was wheezing and sobbing on the hearth rug. "You are in luck, Wormtail," said a cold, high-pitched voice from the depths on the chair in which the owl had landed. "You are very fortunate indeed. Your blunder has not ruined everything. He is dead." "My lord," gasped the man on the floor. "My lord, I am so pleased and so sorry." "Nagini," said the cold voice, "you are out of luck. I will not be feeding Wormtail to you after all, but never mind, never mind. There is still Harry Potter." The snake hissed. Violet could see its tongue fluttering. "Now, Wormtail," said the cold voice, "perhaps one more little reminder why I will not tolerate another blunder from you." "My lord, no, I beg you." The tip of a wand emerged from around the back of the chair. It was pointing at Wormtail. "Crucio," said the cold voice. Wormtail screamed as though every nerve in his body were on fire. The screaming filled Violet's ears as the back of her head exploded with pain. She was yelling too. Voldemort would hear her, would know she was there. "Violet, Violet." Violet opened her eyes. She was laying on her back on the floor of Professor Vector's classroom with her hands over her face. Her head was throbbing. She must have pitched backward in her chair and fallen. The whole class was standing around her, and Hermione was kneeling next to her, looking terrified. "Violet, are you all right?" she said. "She isn't all right," said Professor Vector, pushing through the crowd to kneel beside Violet as well. "Up, Miss Potter, and look at me." "Look, please." Professor Vector's pale grey eyes stared into Violet's bewildered gaze, flicking between each of her eyes in turn. She pressed a cool hand to Violet's forehead and tutted. "You are burning up, child. You will go to the hospital wing." "Come, stand up." She helped heave Violet to her feet. "I'm okay," Violet lied. "I'm just hot. I need air, I think." "Hospital wing," repeated Professor Vector, steering her toward the door as the crowd parted around them. "Leave your things. I will have them sent to you." Violet found herself put out into the corridor with the door shut firmly behind her. She stood there, swaying on her feet. Professor Vector said she was burning up, but Violet hadn't felt so cold since she was pulled out the lake in February. Something was wrong. Her feet moved beneath her, but Violet had no intention whatsoever of going to the hospital wing. Her head was still pounding, but so was her heart in her chest, beating hard with a terror that she couldn't begin to explain if she tried, but knew in her bones that it could only mean one thing: she needed to find Harry. She needed to see her brother, see that he was alive and unharmed and all in one piece, because a terrible, terrible voice in the back of her aching head was telling her that he wasn't. She took the stone steps 2 at a time, half skipping in her haste. Harry's class was on the other side of the castle, but there was a corridor that she could cut across that led straight there. The sunlight flashed in a dizzying strobe effect as she ran through the halls, passing window after window. She rounded a corner, readying herself for a long sprint, only to stop dead in her tracks. Harry was standing at the end of the hall. "Harry," she called at the exact moment he said, "Violet, what are you doing here?" they said together as they began to move towards each other. For a moment, Violet feared she was caught in another dream, that she would reach her brother and collide with a mirror instead, or else pass through each other like smoke. But when they met in the middle and reached for one another, Harry's hand was as solid as the floor beneath her feet. "I was coming to find you," Harry said breathlessly, as though he'd been running as well. I had another dream, Roman 6. A vision or something about Voldemort. Wormtail was there, Violet said. Harry's eyes widened. You saw it too? I passed out in arithmancy, she admitted. It was too hot, and my head hurt from the stunning, so I closed my eyes, and then Harry grabbed her other hand as well, squeezing her fingers tightly. We need to go to Professor Dumbledore, he said seriously. My scar hurt. Sirius said whenever that happened, I had to go and tell Dumbledore. We need to tell him what we saw. Violet nodded, and the two of them immediately set off back the way she had just come from, walking quickly hand in hand until they arrived in front of the stone gargoyle that led to Professor Dumbledore's office. You know the password? Violet asked. The look on Harry's face revealed that no, he didn't. Sherbet lemon, he tried tentatively. The gargoyle didn't move. Okay, just start naming sweets, said Harry, staring at it. It's got to be one of them. Pear drop, licorice wand. Fizzing Whizbee, Violet tried. Drooble's best blowing gum. Birdie Bart's every flavor beans. Oh no, he doesn't like them, does he? Oh, just open, can't you? He said angrily. We really need to get in, it's urgent. The gargoyle remained immovable. Harry kicked it and immediately hissed in pain. Harry. Don't do that, Violet chided. What if it wakes up and attacks us instead? Chocolate frog, Harry yelled, standing on one leg. Sugar quill, cockroach cluster. The gargoyle sprang to life and jumped aside. Violet and Harry blinked at one another. Cockroach cluster, she repeated, amazed. I was only joking. I didn't think it'd work. They hurried through the gap in the walls and stepped onto the foot of a spiral stone staircase, which moved slowly upward as the doors closed behind them, taking them up to a polished oak door with a brass knocker. They could hear voices from inside the office. As they stepped off the moving staircase, Harry held up his free hand, listening. Dumbledore, I'm afraid I don't see the connection, don't see it at all. It was the voice of the Minister of Magic, Cornelius Fudge. Ludo says Bertha's perfectly capable of getting herself lost. I agree we would have expected to have her found by now, but all the same, we've no evidence of foul play, Dumbledore, none at all. As for her disappearance being linked with Barty Crouch's, and what do you think's happened to Barty Crouch, Minister? Said Moody's growling voice. I see two possibilities, Alistair, said Fudge. Either Crouch has finally cracked, more than likely, I'm sure you'll agree, given his personal history, lost his mind, and gone wandering off somewhere. He wandered extremely quickly, if that is the case, Cornelius, said Dumbledore calmly. Or else, well, Fudge sounded embarrassed. Well, I'll reserve judgment until after I've seen the place where he was found, but you say it was just past the Beauxbatons' carriage. Dumbledore, you know what that woman is. I consider her to be a very able headmistress and an excellent dancer, said Dumbledore quietly. Dumbledore, come, said Fudge angrily. Don't you think you might be prejudiced in her favor because of Hagrid? They don't all turn out harmless if, indeed, you can call Hagrid harmless, with that monster fixation he's got. I know more suspect Madame Maxime than Hagrid, said Dumbledore, just as calmly. I think it possible that it is you who are prejudiced, Cornelius. Can we wrap up this discussion? Growled Moody. Yes, let's go down to the grounds then, said Fudge impatiently. No, it's not that, said Moody. It's just that the Potter twins would like a word with you, Dumbledore. They're right outside the door. The door of the office opened. Hello, you two, said Moody. Come in then. Still holding hands, Violet and Harry walked inside. They had both been in Dumbledore's office before, but never together. It was a very beautiful, circular room, lined with pictures of previous headmasters and headmistresses of Hogwarts, all of whom were fast asleep, their chests rising and falling gently. Cornelius Fudge was standing beside Dumbledore's desk, wearing his usual pinstriped cloak and holding his lime-green bowler hat. Harry, Violet, said Fudge jovially, moving forward. How are the two of you getting on? Fine, they lied together. Fudge made a curious expression, the one most everyone did when the twins accidentally spoke in unison. We were just talking about the night when Mr. Crouch turned up the grounds, said Fudge, looking to Harry. "It was you who found him, was it not?" "Yes," said Harry. He hesitated a moment, then added, "I didn't see Madame Maxime anywhere, though, and she'd have a job of hiding, wouldn't she?" Dumbledore smiled at Harry behind Fudge's back, his eyes twinkling. "Yes, well," said Fudge, looking embarrassed. "We're about to go for a short walk on the grounds, if you'll excuse us." "Perhaps if you just go back to your classes. We wanted to talk to you, Professor," Harry said quickly, squeezing Violet's hand as he looked at Dumbledore, who gave them both a swift, searching look. "Wait here for me, please," he said. "Our examination of the grounds will not take long." The three men trooped out in silence past Harry and Violet and closed the door. After a minute or two, they heard the clunks of Moody's wooden leg growing fainter in the corridor below. Violet looked around. "Hello, Fawkes," she said. Fawkes, Professor Dumbledore's phoenix, was standing on his golden perch beside the door. The size of a swan, with magnificent scarlet and gold plumage, he swished his long tail and blinked benignly at Violet. "I never got the chance to thank you," she said, walking slowly up to Fawkes's perch, "for saving Harry. He told me all about how you helped in the Chamber of Secrets against the basilisk. That was very brave of you, Fawkes. Thank you for bringing him back safe." While she couldn't be sure how much Fawkes actually understood her, Violet took the way he inclined his magnificent head toward her to be a gracious gesture. "Romans 6, said Harry suddenly. "Come look at this." Violet turned around to see Harry standing on the other side of the room, holding open the door of a narrow black cabinet. A silver-white light was emanating from within, shining off the rims of his glasses. "Harry," Violet hissed in alarm, "stop touching things. You can't just go digging around in Dumbledore's stuff." "It was already open," Harry said defensively. "Come and look at this. There's something funny in this bowl." "What bowl?" Violet asked despite herself. She glanced anxiously at Fawkes, sure that any second now he was going to start crowing an alert to Professor Dumbledore that somebody was snooping in his belongings. But the Phoenix's eyes were now closed, his head turned away from her entirely. "I can't tell what it is," Harry was saying, his voice oddly muffled. Violet looked back to see his entire head now inside the cabinet. He had his wand out and was poking at something within it. "Stop touching things," Violet hissed again. "Well, come and look then," said Harry, whipping around to face her. Violet stomped to his side and looked into the cabinet, just to see what all the fuss was about. A shallow stone basin lay there, with odd carvings around the edge, runes and symbols that Violet didn't recognize. The silvery light was coming from the basin's contents, which were like nothing Violet had ever seen before. She could not tell whether the substance was liquid or gas. It was a bright, whitish silver, and it was moving ceaselessly. The surface of it became ruffled like water beneath wind, and then, like clouds, separated and swirled smoothly. It looked like light made liquid or like wind made solid. Violet understood immediately why it had captivated Harry so. "Look," Harry said, and prodded the substance with his wand. The surface of the silvery stuff inside the basin began to swirl very fast. The two of them leaned closer, their heads bumping together as they bent right inside the cabinet. The silvery substance had become transparent. It looked like glass. Violet looked down into it, expecting to see the stone bottom of the basin, and saw instead an enormous room below the surface of the mysterious substance, a room into which they seemed to be looking through a circular window of the ceiling. The room was dimly lit. It reminded Violet of the Hogwarts dungeons, with its lack of windows and many torches in brackets lining the dark walls. There were rows and rows of witches and wizards seated around every wall on what seemed to be benches rising in levels. An empty chair stood in the very center of the room. There was something about the chair that gave Violet an ominous feeling. Chains encircled the arms of it, as though its occupants were usually tied to it. "Where is this place?" Violet whispered, and the image swirled as her breath rippled over the substance. "Not Hogwarts," said Harry. He leaned closer so that the tip of his nose was only an inch away from the surface. "There's too many people for them all to be teachers." They're all looking at something, but I can't see. Harry tilted his head, leaning even closer. His nose touched the strange substance, and his body jerked alarmingly before going very still. "Harry," Violet said. Harry did not respond. He did not move, his eyes open. The very point of his nose dipped into the substance in the bowl. "Harry." Violet grabbed the back of his robes and yanked. Harry staggered backward with a yelp, banging his head on the cabinet. "I was in the room," he gasped, staring and pointing at the strange basin. "I was looking at it, then I was in it, but nobody saw me. Come on, Romans 6, look." Before she could stop him, Harry grabbed her by the hand and plunged their fists into the basin. Dumbledore's office gave an almighty lurch. Violet was thrown forward, pitched headfirst into the substance, but her head did not hit the stone bottom. She was falling through something icy cold and black. It was like being sucked into a dark whirlpool, and suddenly she found herself sitting on a bench at the end of the room inside the basin, a bench raised high above the others. She looked up at the high stone ceiling, expecting to see the circular window through which they had fallen, but there was nothing there but dark, solid stone. Breathing hard and fast, Violet looked around them. Harry was sat right beside her and still clutching her hand, but not one of the witches and wizards in the room, and there were at least 200 of them, was looking at them. Not one of them seemed to have noticed that a pair of 14-year-olds had just dropping from the ceiling into their midst. Violet turned to the wizard next to her on the bench and uttered a loud cry of surprise that reverberated around the silent room. She was sitting right next to Albus Dumbledore. "Professor," Violet said in a kind of strangled whisper, "we're so sorry I told Harry not to touch," but Dumbledore didn't move or speak. He ignored Violet completely. Like every other wizard on the benches, he was staring into the far corner of the room where there was a door. "He can't see or hear us," Harry said quietly, and Violet watched in horror as he waved his hand very fast in front of Professor Dumbledore's face. Dumbledore didn't so much as blink. "We're not really here, Violet." "Then where are we?" Violet whispered, glancing nervously at all the stern, very serious-looking people all around them. I think this is a memory," said Harry. "Like when I went into Tom Riddle's diary. But this might be Dumbledore's memory." Violet stared hard at Professor Dumbledore. If this was a memory, it couldn't be from all that long ago. The Dumbledore sitting next to her now was silver-haired, just like the present-day Dumbledore. "What is this place?" she heard Harry mutter, craning his neck to look around them. "What's everybody waiting for?" Violet looked around more carefully. There was a bleak and forbidding air about the place. There were no pictures on the walls, no decorations at all. Just these serried rows of benches, rising in levels all around the room, all positioned so that they had a clear view of the chair with the chains on its arms. "It looks like a dungeon." Before they could reach any further conclusions about the place, they heard footsteps. The door in the corner of the dungeon opened, and 3 people entered, or at least 1 man, flanked by 2 Dementors. Violet felt Harry go rigid beside her, and heard the sharp, fearful breath that he sucked into his lungs. The Dementors, tall, hooded creatures whose faces were concealed, were gliding slowly toward the center of the room, each grasping one of the man's arms with their dead and rotten-looking hands. The man between them looked as though he was about to faint. He also looked extremely familiar. "That's Karkaroff," Violet gasped, as the Dementors pushed the man into the chained chair and glided back out of the room. The door swung shut behind them. "Harry, I think this is a trial." Harry leaned forward in his seat, suddenly looking less afraid and much more interested. Unlike Dumbledore, Karkaroff looked much younger. His hair and goatee were black. He was not dressed in sleek furs, but in thin and ragged robes. He was shaking. As they watched, the chains on the arms of the chair glowed suddenly gold and snaked their way up Karkaroff's arms, binding him there. "Igor Karkaroff," said a curt voice to their left. Violet and Harry looked around and saw Mr. Crouch standing up in the middle of the bench beside them. Crouch's hair was dark, his face was much less lined. He looked fit and alert. You have been brought from Azkaban to present evidence to the Ministry of Magic. You have given us to understand that you have important information for us." Karkaroff straightened himself as best he could, tightly bound to the chair. "I have, sir," he said, and although his voice was very scared, Violet could still hear the familiar, unctuous note in it. "I wish to be of use the ministry. I wish to help. I know that the ministry is trying to round up the last of the Dark Lord's supporters. I am eager to assist in any way I can." There was a murmur around the benches. Some of the wizards and witches were surveying Karkaroff with interest, others with pronounced mistrust. Then Violet heard, quite distinctly from Dumbledore's other side, a familiar, growling voice saying, "Filth." She and Harry leaned forward to see past Dumbledore. Mad-Eye Moody was sitting there, except that there was a very noticeable difference in his appearance. He did not have his magical eye, but two normal ones. Both were looking down upon Karkaroff, and both were narrowed in intense dislike. "Crouch is going to let him out," Moody breathed quietly to Dumbledore. "He's done a deal with him. Took me 6 months to track him down, and Crouch is going to let him go if he's got enough new names. Let's hear his information, I say, and throw him straight back to the Dementors." Dumbledore made a small noise of dissent through his long, crooked nose. "Ah, I was forgetting. You don't like the Dementors, do you, Albus?" said Moody with a sardonic smile. "No," said Dumbledore calmly, "I'm afraid I don't. I have long felt the Ministry is wrong to ally itself with such creatures. But for filth like this—" Moody said softly. "You say you have names for us, Karkaroff," said Mr. Crouch. "Let us hear them, please." "You must understand," said Karkaroff hurriedly, "that he, who must not be named, operated always in the greatest secrecy. He preferred that I mean to say, his supporters and I regret now, very deeply, that I ever counted myself among them." "Get on with it," sneered Moody. "We never knew the names of every one of our fellows. He alone knew exactly who we all were, which was a wise move, wasn't it, as it prevented someone like you from turning all of them in," muttered Moody. "Yet you say you have some names for us," said Mr. Crouch. I do," said Karkaroff breathlessly. "And these were important supporters, mark you. People I saw with my own eyes doing his bidding. I give this information as a sign that I fully and totally renounce him, and am filled with remorse so deep I can barely—" "The names are," said Mr. Crouch sharply. Karkaroff drew a deep breath. "There was Antonin Dolohov," he said. I saw him torture countless muggles and non-supporters of the Dark Lord." "And helped him do it," murmured Moody. "We have already apprehended Dolohov," said Crouch. "He was caught shortly after yourself." "Indeed," said Karkaroff, his eyes widening. I am delighted to hear it, but he didn't look it. Violet could see that this news had come as a real blow to him. One of his names was worthless." "Any others?" said Crouch coldly. "Why, yes. There was Rosier," said Karkaroff hurriedly. "Evan Rosier." "Rosier is dead," said Crouch. "He was caught shortly after you were too. He preferred to fight rather than come quietly, and was killed in the struggle." "Took a bit of me with him, through," whispered Moody to Dumbledore, and Violet peered around to see him indicating the large chunk missing from his nose. No more than Rosier deserved," said Karkaroff, a real note of panic in his voice now. Violet could see that he was starting to worry that none of his information would be of any use to the Ministry. Karkaroff's eyes darted toward the door in the corner, behind which the Dementors undoubtedly still waited. "Any more?" said Crouch. "Yes," said Karkaroff. "There was Travers. He helped murder the McKinnons. Mulciber, he specialized in the Imperious Curse, forced countless people to do horrific things. Rookwood, who was a spy, and passed he who must not be named useful information from inside the Ministry itself." Violet could tell that, this time, Karkaroff had struck gold. The watching crowd was all murmuring together. "Rookwood," said Mr. Crouch, nodding to a witch sitting in front of him who began scribbling upon her piece of parchment. "Augustus Rookwood of the Department of Mysteries." "The very same," said Karkaroff eagerly. I believe he used a network of well-placed wizards, both inside the ministry and out, to collect information. But Travis and Mulciber we have, said Mr. Crouch. Very well, Karkaroff, if that is all, you will be returned to Azkaban while we decide. Not yet, cried Karkaroff, looking quite desperate. Wait, I have more. There was an informant, Warrington, Randall Warrington, Randall Warrington, Crouch repeated, sounding unimpressed. The genealogist. Yes, yes. He gave names people to be targeted. Mr. Crouch nodded again to the woman in front of him, who scribbled some more on her parchment. Karkaroff was sweating in the torchlight, his white skin contrasting strongly with the black of his hair and beard. Another, he shouted. Snape, Severus Snape. Snape has been cleared by this council, said Crouch disdainfully. He has been vouched for by Albus Dumbledore. No, shouted Karkaroff, straining at the chains that bound him to the chair. I assure you. Severus Snape is a Death Eater. Dumbledore got to his feet. I have given evidence already on this matter, he said calmly. Severus Snape was indeed a Death Eater. However, he rejoined our side before Lord Voldemort's downfall and turned spy for us, at great personal risk. He is now no more a Death Eater than I am. Violet stared open-mouthed at Dumbledore as he sat back down beside her. On his other side, Mad-Eye Moody was wearing a look of deep skepticism behind Dumbledore's back. Very well, Karkaroff, said Crouch coldly. You have been of assistance. I shall review your case. You will return to Azkaban in the meantime. Mr. Crouch's voice faded. The dungeon was dissolving as though it were made of smoke. Everything was fading into swirling, frigid darkness. And then the dungeon returned. Violet and Harry were still next to each other, but in different seats, still on the highest bench, but this time to the left side of Mr. Crouch. The atmosphere seemed quite different, relaxed, even cheerful. The witches and wizards around the walls were talking to one another, almost as though they were at some sort of sporting event. But Violet couldn't have been in a more opposite mood. They may have come to a different time, a different memory, but she was still very occupied in the things she'd just heard in the last one. Severus Snape was indeed a Death Eater. Professor Dumbledore had just come right out and said it in plain English. All the suspicion, all the questions and fears she'd been carrying around all year long were confirmed with a single, horrifying sentence. Professor Snape was a Death Eater. Her teacher, the head of her house, a man she saw every single day eating and talking up at the high table, a man she had come to consider as something of a mentor. How many times had been alone in a room with him? How could she not have seen him for Themonstrathat he was? Harry nudged her in the ribs, and Violet jumped, startled out of her growing fit of rage. Look, Harry said, pointing across the aisle. Rita Skeeter. Halfway up the rows of the benches opposite sat a witch in magenta robes. She had short blonde hair and was sucking the end of an acid green quill. It was unmistakably a younger Rita Skeeter. Violet looked around. Dumbledore was sitting beside her again, wearing different robes. Next to Harry, Mr. Crouch was looking more tired and somehow fiercer, gaunter. Some time had passed since the last trial. The door in the corner opened, and Ludo Bagman walked into the room. This was not, however, a Ludo Bagman gone to seed, but a Ludo Bagman who was clearly at the height of his Quidditch-playing fitness. His nose wasn't broken now. He was tall and lean and muscular. Bagman looked nervous as he sat down in the chain chair, but it did not bind him there as it had bound Karkaroff, and Bagman, perhaps taking heart from this, glanced around at the watching crowd, waved at a couple of them, and managed a small smile. Ludo Bagman, you've been brought here in front of the Council of Magical Law to answer charges relating to the activities of the Death Eaters, said Mr. Crouch. We have heard the evidence against you and are about to reach our verdict. Do you have anything to add to your testimony before we pronounce judgment? Harry and Violet looked round at each other in shock. Ludo Bagman, a Death Eater. Only, said Bagman, smiling awkwardly. Well, I know I've been a bit of an idiot. One or two wizards and witches in the surrounding seats smiled indulgently. Mr. Crouch did not appear to share their feelings. He was staring down at Ludo Bagman with an expression of the utmost severity and dislike. "You never spoke a truer word, boy," someone muttered dryly to Dumbledore behind Violet. She looked around and saw Moody sitting there again. "If I didn't know he'd always been dim, I'd have said some of those bludgers had permanently affected his brain." "Ludovic Bagman, you were caught passing information to Lord Voldemort's supporters," said Mr. Crouch. "For this, I suggest a term of imprisonment in Azkaban lasting no less than—" But there was an angry outcry from the surrounding benches. Several of the witches and wizards around the wall stood up, shaking their heads and even their fists at Mr. Crouch. "But I've told you, I had no idea," Bagman called earnestly over the crowd's babble, his round blue eyes widening. "None at all. Old Rookwood was friend of my dad's. Never crossed my mind he was in with you-know-who. I thought I was collecting information for our side, and Rookwood kept talking about getting me a job in the ministry later on. Once my Quidditch days are over, you know. I mean, I can't keep getting hit by bludgers for the rest of my life, can I?" There were titters from the crowd. "It will be put to the vote," said Mr. Crouch coldly. He turned to the right-hand side of the dungeon. "The jury will please raise their hands, those in favor of imprisonment." Violet and Harry looked toward the right-hand side of the dungeon. Not one person raised their hand. Many of the witches and wizards around the walls began to clap. One of the witches on the jury stood up. "Yes," barked Crouch. "We just like to congratulate Mr. Bagman on his splendid performance for England in the Quidditch match against Turkey last Saturday," the witch said breathlessly. Mr. Crouch looked furious. The dungeon was ringing with applause now. Bagman got to his feet and bowed, beaming. "Despicable, Mr. Crouch spat at Dumbledore, sitting down as Bagman walked out of the dungeon. "Rook would get him a job indeed. The day Ludo Bagman joins us will be a sad day indeed for the ministry." And the dungeon dissolved again. When it had returned, Violet looked around. She and Harry were still sitting between Dumbledore and Mr. Crouch, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. There was total silence, broken only by the dry sobs of a frail, wispy-looking witch in the seat next to Mr. Crouch. She was clutching a handkerchief to her mouth with trembling hands. Violet looked over at Crouch and saw that he looked gaunter and grayer than ever before. A nerve was twitching in his temple. "Bring them in," he said, and his voice echoed through the silent dungeon. The door in the corner opened yet again. 6 Dementors entered this time, flanking a group of 4 people. Violet saw the people in the crowd turn to look up at Mr. Crouch. A few of them whispered to one another. The Dementors placed each of the 4 people in the 4 chairs, with chained arms that now stood in the dungeon floor. There was a thick-set man who stared blankly up at Crouch, a thinner and more nervous-looking man whose eyes were darting around the crowd, a beautiful woman with thick, shining dark hair and heavily hooded eyes, who was sitting in the chained chair as though it were a throne, and a boy in his late teens who looked nothing short of petrified. He was shivering, his straw-colored hair all over his face, his freckled skin milk-white. The wispy little witch beside Crouch began to rock backward and forward in her seat, whimpering into her handkerchief. Crouch stood up. He looked down upon the 4 in front of him, and there was pure hatred on his face. "You have been brought here before the Council of Magical Law," he said clearly, "so that we may pass judgment on you for a crime so heinous." "Father," said the boy with the straw-colored hair. "Father, please, that we have rarely heard the like of it within this court," said Crouch, speaking more loudly, drowning out his son's voice. "We have heard the evidence against you. The 4 of you stand accused of capturing an Auror Frank Longbottom and subjecting him to the Cruciatus Curse, believing him to have knowledge of the present whereabouts of your exiled master, he who must not be named." "Father, I didn't," shrieked the boy in chains below. "I didn't, I swear it, Father. Don't send me back to the Dementors." "You are further accused," bellowed Mr. Crouch, "of using the Cruciatus Curse on Frank Longbottom's wife when he would not give you information. You plan to restore he who must not be named to power and to resume the lives of violence you presumably led while he was strong. I now ask the jury, "Mother!" screamed the boy below, and the wispy little witch beside Crouch began to sob, rocking faster. "Mother, stop him." "Mother, I didn't do it. It wasn't me." "I now ask the jury," shouted Mr. Crouch, "to raise their hands if they believe, as I do, that these crimes deserve a life sentence in Azkaban." In unison, the witches and wizards around the right-hand side of the dungeon raised their hands. The crowd around the wall began to clap as it had for Bagman, their faces full of savage triumph. The boy began to scream. "No, mother, no. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't know. Don't send me there. Don't let him." The Dementors were gliding back into the room. The boy's three companions rose quietly from their seats. The woman with the dark hair looked up at Crouch and called, "The Dark Lord will rise again, Crouch. Throw us into Azkaban. We will wait. He will rise again and will come for us. He will reward us beyond any of his other supporters. We alone were faithful. We alone tried to find him." But the boy was trying to fight off the Dementors, even though Violet could see their cold, draining power starting to affect him. The crowd was jeering, some of them on their feet, as the woman swept out of the dungeon and the boy continued to struggle. "I'm your son," he screamed up at Crouch. "I'm your son." "You are no son of mine," bellowed Mr. Crouch, his eyes bulging suddenly. "I have no son." The wispy witch beside him gave a great gasp and slumped in her seat. She had fainted. Crouch appeared not to have noticed. "Take them away," Crouch roared at the Dementors, spit flying from his mouth. "Take them away, and may they rot there." "Father, father, I wasn't involved." "No, no, father, please." "I think, children, it is time to return to my office," said a quiet voice in Violet's ear. Violet whipped around. There was an Albus Dumbledore sitting on her right, watching Crouch's son behind dragged away by the Dementors, and there was an Albus Dumbledore sitting behind her, looking right at her. "Come," said the Dumbledore behind her, and he placed a hand upon both her and Harry's shoulders. Violet felt herself rising into the air. The dungeon dissolved around them. For a moment, all was blackness, and then she felt as though she had done a slow-motion somersault, suddenly landing flat on her feet in what seemed like the dazzling light of Dumbledore's sunlit office. The stone basin was shimmering in the cabinet in front of her, and Albus Dumbledore was standing beside her. She was still holding onto Harry's hand. "Professor," Harry gasped. "I know we shouldn't have the cabinet door was sort of open, and I made Violet. She tried to stop me." "I quite understand," said Dumbledore. He lifted the basin, carried it over to his desk, placed it upon the polished top, and sat down in the chair behind it. He motioned for Harry and Violet to sit down opposite him. They did so. Violet was staring fearfully at Dumbledore, but Harry's eyes were still fixed on the stone basin. "What is it?" he asked shakily. It is called a pensive," said Dumbledore. "I sometimes find, and I am sure you know the feeling, that I simply have too many thoughts and memories crammed into my mind." Violet nodded weakly. She knew the feeling well. Beside her, Harry shook his head. "At these times," said Dumbledore, indicating the stone basin, "I use the pensive. One simply siphons the excess thoughts from one's mind, pours them into the basin, and examines them at one's leisure. It becomes easier to spot patterns and links, you understand, when they are in this form." "So they are your memories," Violet said, staring at the surface of the basin. Its contents had returned to their original, silvery white state, swirling and rippling beneath her gaze. "Certainly," said Dumbledore. "Let me show you." Professor Dumbledore drew his wand out of the inside of his robes and placed the tip into his own silvery hair near his temple. When he took the wand away, hair seemed to be clinging to it, but then they saw that it was in fact a glistening strand of the same strange silvery white substance that filled the pensive. Dumbledore added the fresh thought to the basin, and Violet, astonished, saw her and Harry's faces swimming side by side in the surface of the bowl. Dumbledore placed his long hands on either side of the pensive and swirled it, rather as a gold prospector would pan for fragments of gold. And Violet saw her and Harry's face merge and melt together, growing paler as they changed smoothly into the face of Professor Snape, who opened his mouth and spoke to the ceiling, his voice echoing slightly. It's coming back. Karkaroff's too. Stronger and clearer than ever. A connection I could have made without assistance, Dumbledore sighed. But never mind. He peered over the top of his half-moon spectacles at the two of them. I was using the pensive when Mr. Fudge arrived for our meeting and put it away rather hastily. Undoubtedly, I did not fasten the cabinet door properly. Naturally, it would have attracted your attention. I'm sorry, Harry mumbled. I told him not to touch it, said Violet, tearing her eyes away from Snape's face, which continued to swirl around the bowl. Dumbledore shook his head. Curiosity is not a sin, he said, but we should exercise caution with our curiosity. Yes, indeed. Frowning slightly, he prodded the thoughts within the basin with the tip of his wand. Instantly a figure rose out of it, a plump, scowling girl of about 16, who began to revolve slowly, with her feet still in the basin. She took no notice of them whatsoever. When she spoke, her voice echoed as Professor Snape's had done, as though it were coming from the depths of the stone basin. He put a hex on me, Professor Dumbledore, and I was only teasing him, sir. I only said I'd seen him kissing Florence behind the greenhouses last Thursday. But why, Bertha? Said Dumbledore sadly, looking up at the now silently revolving girl. Why did you have to follow him in the first place? Bertha, Harry whispered, staring at the girl. Was that Bertha Jorkins? Yes, said Dumbledore, prodding the thoughts in the basin again. Bertha sank back into them, and they became silvery and opaque once more. That was Bertha as I remembered her at school. The silvery light from the pensive illuminated Dumbledore's face. The many, many lines it bore, and how terribly thin it was in places, especially around his rather tired-looking eyes. Violet remembered, from her very first chocolate frog card of all places, that Professor Dumbledore was said to be well over 100 years old, but she hadn't really believed it until now. So, children, said Dumbledore quietly. Before you two got lost in my thoughts, you wanted to tell me something. Yes, said Harry at once. Professor I was in divination just now, and I fell asleep. Quite understandable, said Dumbledore mildly. Continue. And I was in arithmancy, Violet added. Only I hit my head earlier, and the room was swimming. I just closed my eyes to rest them. We had a dream, said Harry. Both of us the same dream, about Lord Voldemort. He was torturing Wormtail. You know who Wormtail? I do know, said Dumbledore promptly. Please continue. Voldemort got a letter from an owl. He said something like, Wormtail's mistake had been repaired. Your blunder has not ruined everything, Violet repeated, recalling the high, cold voice. Harry nodded encouragingly, and he said that someone was dead. Then he said Wormtail wouldn't be fed to the snake. He called it Nagini, because he said he'd be feeding me to it instead. Then he did the Cruciatus curse on Wormtail and my scar hurt, said Harry. It woke me up, it hurt so badly. I fell out of my chair, Violet muttered, embarrassed. Dumbledore merely looked at them, his eyes moving between their faces to land on Harry's. I see, said Dumbledore quietly. I see. Now, has your scar hurt at any other time this year, excepting the time it woke you up over the summer? No, how did you know it woke me over the summer? Said Harry, sounding astonished. You are not Sirius's only correspondent, said Dumbledore. He and I have been in frequent contact since his trial and acquittal. Dumbledore got up and began walking up and down behind his desk. Every now and then, he placed his wand tip to his temple, removed another shining silver thought, and added it to the pensive. The thoughts inside began to swirl so fast that Violet couldn't make out anything clearly. It was merely a blur of color. Professor, she said quietly, after a couple of minutes. Dumbledore stopped pacing and looked at Violet. My apologies, he said quietly. He sat back down at his desk. May I ask, sir, do you know why Harry's scar hurts him? She asked. Dumbledore looked very intently at Harry for a moment and then said, I have a theory, no more than that. It is my belief that Harry's scar hurts both when Lord Voldemort is near him and when he is feeling a particularly strong surge of hatred. But why? Asked Harry. Because you and he are connected by the curse that failed to kill you, said Dumbledore. That is no ordinary scar. Violet turned and stared at Harry. Their hands were still clasped tightly together, even after all they had been through, hanging together in the open space between their chairs. Her eyes fixed upon the lightning bolt-shaped scar that marred her brother's forehead, that had been there for as long as either of them could remember that the Dursleys had once lied about having occurred in the car crash that killed their parents. But there was no crash. It was a curse that left that scar on Harry's head when Lord Voldemort's spell backfired after trying to kill him as a baby. Violet wondered, not the first time, though she never dwelled on the thought for long, what might have happened if Voldemort had turned his wand on her first. Instead of Harry, would she be the one with a lightning bolt scar? Or would she even be there at all? So you think? That dream. Harry said slowly, did it really happen? It is possible, said Dumbledore. I would say probable. Tell me, did either of you see Voldemort? No, said Harry as they both shook their heads. Just the back of his chair. But there wouldn't have been anything to see, would there? I mean, he hasn't got a body, has he? He had a wand, Violet said. A sudden chill ran down her spine. If he hasn't got a body, then how was he holding a wand? How indeed, muttered Dumbledore. How indeed? Nobody spoke for a while. Dumbledore was gazing across the room, and every now and then placing his wand tip to his temple and adding another shining silver thought to the seething mass within the pensive. Professor, said Harry, breaking the silence at last, do you think he's getting stronger? Voldemort, said Dumbledore, fixing Harry with a piercing stare across the pensive. Once again, Harry, I can only give you my suspicions. Dumbledore sighed again. He looked older and wearier than ever. The years of Voldemort's ascent to power, he said, were marked with disappearances. Bertha Jorkins has vanished without a trace in the place where Voldemort was certainly known to be last. Mr. Crouch, too, has disappeared, within these very grounds. And there was a third disappearance, one which the Ministry, I regret to say, do not consider of any importance, because it concerns a Muggle. His name was Frank Bryce. He lived in the village where Voldemort's father grew up, and he has not been seen since last August. You see, I read the Muggle newspapers, unlike most of my Ministry friends. Dumbledore looked very seriously at the pair of them. These disappearances seem to me to be linked. The Ministry disagrees, as you may have heard, while waiting outside my office. Violet flushed, ashamed to have been caught listening in on that private conversation. Silence fell between them again, Dumbledore extracting thoughts every now and then. Violet felt as though they ought to go, but Harry's firm, if slightly sweaty grip on her hand kept her in her seat. Professor, he said again. Yes, Harry, said Dumbledore. Could I ask you about that court thing we were in? In the pensive. You could, said Dumbledore heavily. I attended it many times, but some trials come back to me more clearly than others, particularly now. You know the trial you found us in, the one with Crouch's son. Well, Harry paused, wetting his lips nervously. Were they talking about Neville's parents? Violet looked up sharply. She'd been so distracted by her own emotions to register it at the time, but they did hear the name Longbottom, Frank Longbottom and his wife, the victims of the group of 4. Were those Neville's parents? Dumbledore was looking very intently at Harry. Has Neville never told you why he has been brought up by his grandmother? He said. Harry, who had shared a dormitory with Neville for 4 years now, shook his head. Yes, they were talking about Neville's parents, said Professor Dumbledore. His father, Frank, was an Auror just like Professor Moody. He and his wife, Alice, were tortured for information about Voldemort's whereabouts after he lost his powers, as you heard. So they're dead, said Violet quietly. No, said Dumbledore, his voice full of a bitterness Violet had never heard there before. They are insane. Both are in St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. I believe Neville visits them with his grandmother during the holidays. They do not recognize him. Violet and Harry sat there, horror-struck. Violet had often mourned not getting the chance to know their parents, but she had never considered what it could be like for her and Harry's parents not to know them. Even just imagining it, the pain was unspeakable. The Longbottoms were very popular, said Dumbledore. The attacks on them came after Voldemort's fall from power, just when everyone thought they were safe. Those attacks caused a wave of fury such as I have never known. The Ministry was under great pressure to catch those who had done it. Unfortunately, the Longbottoms' evidence was given their condition none too reliable. Then Mr. Crouch's son might not have been involved, said Harry slowly. Dumbledore shook his head. As to that, I have no idea. They sank into silence once more, watching the contents on the pensive swirl as Violet listened to the screams of the desperate, terrified boy bouncing off the inside of her skull. He died, she recalled suddenly, only a year after that trial. Harry had told her after Sirius had told him, died alone in Azkaban, and his father never came for his body. There was a question bubbling up inside of her, one that she was not too frightened but too hungry to ask aloud. It concerned the guilt of a living person. "Sir," she heard herself whisper, "I heard at Karkaroff's trial you said." Professor Dumbledore turned his gaze to her. Violet couldn't get the words out of her throat. She stared down at the contents of the pensive again, which seemed to be asking a question for her. Snape's face was swimming on the surface again. Dumbledore glanced down into it, then up and Violet. "Professor Snape was a Death Eater, yes," he said quietly, "which he regrets very dearly to this day. You would have also heard me speak in his defense, as he renounced Lord Voldemort before his exile. But he followed him once," Violet said. She was breathing very fast now, and the anger welling within her was rattling against the lid of its jar, Snape's jar, the very one he had inspired her to think up. He supported Voldemort, helped him, he hurt people. Whatever harm Professor Snape may have caused in his youth, he has spent many years now atoning for it. Dumbledore's tone was gentle but firm, his blue eyes holding hers over the rims of his glasses. "If it is of any comfort to you, Violet, I want you to know that I trust Severus with my life." "What makes you think he's really stopped supporting Voldemort?" Harry asked boldly. Violet realized suddenly that she'd been squeezing his hand far past the point of comfort, though he had yet to let go. Dumbledore held Harry's gaze for a few seconds, then said, "That, I'm afraid, is a matter between Professor Snape and myself." Violet knew the interview was over. Dumbledore did not look angry, yet there was a finality in his tone that told them it was time to go. She stood up, pulling her brother along with her as Dumbledore stood as well. "Children," he said as they reached the door, "please do not speak about Neville's parents to anybody else. He has the right to let people know when he is ready." "Yes, Professor," said Harry, turning to go. And the two of them looked back. Dumbledore was standing over the pensive, his face lit from beneath by its own silvery spots of light, looking over than ever. Violet expected him to swear them to secrecy about Snape as well, to keep his nature hidden to themselves, but Dumbledore wasn't even looking at her at all. He stared at Harry for a moment, and then said, "Good luck with the third task."